You ever been hanging out with friends, everybody's telling stories, and the stories are getting a little bit more ridiculous as they go along, but you feel like everything up to this point has been within the boundaries of reality, and then somebody breaks out a story where you're like, okay, you're passing that off and presenting it as though it happened with real people, with real names, in a real place at a real time, but the details of the story are so incredibly unlikely that it seems like this would better be presented as a fable or some sort of cautionary tale or a joke. And maybe there's a punchline. No, there's no punchline. You're really asking us to believe this. This feels weird. This is the kind of feel that I am getting from the story that the Sadducees are spinning up for Jesus, because they don't even quite parable exactly right. Whereas Jesus tells a story and it's always about someone who is a ways off. Now, there was a man. Now, there was a thing. Now, in a far off country, there was and it always feels like it has a little bit of an air of storytelling to it. These Sadducees are a bit clumsy in the way they introduce their story to try to trap Jesus. And the whole thing just feels ham-fisted and second-rate and just not nearly as good as the stuff that we're getting from Jesus. Not even in terms of theology, just in terms of structure. Here's a passage we're talking about, Matthew 22, starting in verse 23. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to Jesus with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and have children for him. All right, we talked about that yesterday. More on that in a minute. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and third brother, right on down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? Checkmate, Jesus of Nazareth. All right, let's break this down. The Sadducees, who are unapologetically fans of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Law, the Pentateuch, the Torah, whatever you want to call it, they're referencing something here that can be traced back to Genesis 38, squarely within the part of the Bible they are enthusiastic about. And in referencing this practice, they're saying like, okay, well, obviously the scriptures, which I think we can all agree are very important, say that this practice is to occur. But parable time, there were 7 brothers among us. And I wonder, like really? Because Jesus was always pretty particular in his storytelling to make sure that it didn't smack of a lie and that it was evident that we are in story mode here. Whereas these guys clumsily make it sound like it's about them. There's an office guy, a representative from a missions organization who came to a church that I was working at one time, and he did this big presentation, and it was fine. I mean, what they were doing is fine. It's great. That's awesome. It's courageous. It's helping people probably. Like, that's great. But he really thought his thing was really, really cool. And that, you know what? Let me take it easy on that too. I'm glad he believed in his thing. That was awesome. But he got up there and he told this story about this village that he apparently used to go and visit all the time. Like, there was a village. I went there. I traveled there often. I knew the elders of the village. I worked there. And they had this cliff right there next to their village up above it. And all the kids would go up there and they would play. And the kids kept falling off the cliff. They would break all their bones. Some of them would die. It was just terrible. And I was there and I saw this happen and my heart broke for these poor, simple people who didn't know that their kids shouldn't play on cliffs. And eventually the simple people of this village came to me and they said, "Brother, will you build us a hospital at the bottom of this cliff so we can save our poor children who fall off and mangle themselves because they fall off of a cliff?" And he said, and I looked at them and I said, "Maybe instead we should build a fence at the top of the cliff." And there were a bunch of us who were in the room the day this guy showed up and told this story at our church who were like, "Dude, what are you doing? You're passing this off like you were there and like it's an actual thing. This is an old parable from the mission field from a bygone age when these kind of smug paternalistic attitudes toward the people you were in the far reaches of the world to go and serve were a little bit more accepted. Like, that never happened. That no one is that dumb. That never happened. And even if it did, it didn't happen to you because this story predates you by generations. This story's been floating around forever, and you're trying to pass it off like it was you and you were there. And it was just gross because it wasn't him and he wasn't there. And what could have been a trifling offense, that is the telling of an antiquated, not that useful parable, instead turns into something that was like just out and out gross and off-putting. I really feel like this parable in Matthew chapter 22 was going to hit the same way. And people are going to hear this and be like, what? Really? There were 7 brothers among you? That happened to you guys? Really? So this is a real problem you really need help with. And in that manner, the Sadducees are kind of following the playbook of their predecessors, the youngling Pharisees along with the Herodians, who came along and were like, well, we have this really honest question that really affects us, and we really need to get this thing sorted out. And so they hold it out as being a genuine quest for truth, but it obviously isn't. The biases, the smuggery, it's all present right behind it. And if Jesus could sniff out the last malfeasance in terms of the way the question was presented, he's gonna sniff this out too. So they start with a lie. I don't believe for a second there were 7 brothers among them and that this actually happened and they kept dying. I don't believe that. I mean, maybe, but I don't buy it. But whatever, they go on. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. Nothing weird here. That makes sense. I mean, we heard about that in Genesis 38 yesterday. That squares with the beloved account of Ruth and Boaz. Okay, great. But then the same thing happened to the second and third brother, right on down to the 7th. Now, at some point, you got to start imagining that people would have been like, I don't think I want to marry her. She's sort of like a praying mantis or a black widow or something. Like, she keeps killing mates. It just doesn't seem likely the 7 of them would just die at random. I mean, maybe, but I think I might just ask for the opt-out clause. And there was indeed an opt-out clause. You could get the blessing of the patriarch of the family not to go and marry again. And I would think the patriarch of the family in this situation would be like, yeah, 6 of the boys dead. I think we're just going to move on with this one and say it just didn't work out and we wish you the best, young lady. But now in this case, we're to believe that there was no hesitancy and they just kept right on marrying this lady. Well, finally, the woman died. Okay, so there's your scenario. And they don't even really need to ask the next question. Everybody who's there listening, and I'm assuming most of the people who were listening didn't really like these Sadducees at all. This was not a super popular group in the setting where they're saying all of this stuff. I'm sure all of them were like, we see where this is going after the second brother, right? Well, what you're going to try to point out is that resurrection is incompatible with levirate marriage. And then they get to it in verse 28, and I'm sure everybody was like, and there it is. Okay, yep. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? And this is so impotent and lame and weak and uninspired and unimpressive. And I run into this kind of argumentation all around the internet, not just directed at me. I just mean in general. The first thing that's wrong with this is that you've got a ludicrous hypothetical that comes from the extreme fringes of what is possible, and you're trying to read that back onto what is normative and make truth, make theology, make policy, if you will, out of the fringiest of situations. There is already, within the ground rules of levirate marriage, all sorts of solutions to this supposed tension that is being created where people needn't keep dying at this clip. So I don't know what you call the logical fallacy that is arguing normalcy from the fringes, but that's what's going on here. And secondly, there's just a problem with the priorities. Like, of all the concepts that are taught in the Bible, all the things that come up there in the prophets and the Psalms and the history books and all of that, all the things Jesus has said, you think levirate marriage is like the key point? Like, this is the really important thing that we're going to have to square against everything else? It would seem like the bigger, more pressing question for everyone that you might want to interpret levirate marriage in light of would be, what happens to me when I die? Everybody's wondering about that. Everybody cares about that. Everybody's thinking about that gigantic, burning, existential question we all have to wrestle with. This procedural question of what you do in a pre-Bronze Age society where you're doing nomadism and tribalism and you have to marry within your own clan. And what do you do if more than one person dies in the process of trying to redeem that one brother's family lineage and inheritance? Like, that's just not a center-cut question from the human experience. This isn't the thing we all have in common and are wrestling with. So before we even get into Jesus' far superior theological takedown of this thing, it's very evident, even to you and me, who are decidedly not Jesus, that this is not the most impressive strategy, not the most impressive attack. And given his track record, we should rightly anticipate that Jesus is going to disarm this, and these guys are going to come away looking just as stupid as everyone else. What they think they have here is an unbreakable gotcha moment that is going to put Jesus on his heels, because it proves that you can't have both of these things. Well, what about this verse and what about that? See, if we bring them both up out of context, you're in trouble. It's a common play, but this one is so much weaker than even a lot of the ones that I see on the internet, and it's going to be fun to see what Jesus does with this one next. Thanks as always to all of you who support the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. And thanks for being here and doing this with me. I don't know if you noticed, but we just rolled over 500 episodes a little bit ago. That is commitment on your part. Nice job, my friends. Internet high five. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. We'll do this again soon.